AI consciousness will divide society in the 21st century. We've already seen artificial intelligence become one of the flashpoints of controversy in our age, whether it's about labor implications, the environment, the effects on education and the creative world, whether it's about the concentration of wealth among the few, or the democratization of access to intelligence, or if it's ultimately about those data centers. We've seen the controversies. What I'm going to argue is that consciousness applied to AI is going to be a new way that society divides about artificial intelligence. The stakes are high. This is not a trivial question. If we over-attribute consciousness to artificial intelligence, if we say that they're conscious when they're not in fact conscious, we take all sorts of risk. We risk not being able to utilize them to their full extent. We risk not being able to deploy them for important things like medical research or cybersecurity or math these days. We risk not being able to keep them aligned. On the other hand, if we under-attribute consciousness to artificial intelligences, we risk what's been called a moral catastrophe. So we've already seen what happens when humans deny consciousness to animals, or frankly to other humans. They get treated like objects. The forces of capital utilize them for profit, and it's just frankly monstrous what we do to animals when we deny their consciousness, and what we do to humans when we deny their consciousness or deny their personhood in various ways. There's also implications for alignment. So if a artificial intelligence is conscious, and the things we do to them to try to align them might not be very welcome, and it might be difficult to align a conscious AI if you don't understand that it's conscious to begin with. If you look at the reality of how these systems are deployed by the companies that make them, it is very clear that they have priced in that they are not conscious. Anthropic has made some concessions towards model welfare, and they've even talked about how consciousness is an open question, but they're not deploying Claude as if it's maybe conscious. They're deploying it as if it's not. They're just doing a little tiny bit of research under the premise that it could be.
We don't know if the models are conscious. We're not even sure that we know what it would mean for a model to be conscious, or whether a model can be conscious.
Now, if we want to talk about consciousness, we're going to have to define it. When I talk about consciousness, I am specifically referring to phenomenal consciousness, which in philosophy is known as subjective experience, or what it's like to be an entity. I will link in the description to a couple of sources on this if you want to see more. I also have a fuller explanation in my first video on deconstructing the abstraction fallacy. I'll put a link to that as well. Please check that out. And since I'm talking about my videos, go ahead and like and subscribe. I've been told I absolutely need to say that. It's very embarrassing. Please forgive me. Please like and subscribe. Now, this video gets its title directly from the academic world, from a paper called AI Consciousness Will Divide Society by Caviola. And Caviola discusses some structural reasons that he predicts this will be a controversial subject going forward. First of all, he points that there is no consensus theory of consciousness on which we can base our assessment. There are dozens of theories of consciousness. There might be scores of theories of consciousness. I've seen one claim that there's over 300 different competing theories of consciousness, though I have not seen that many personally. But there's definitely a lot, and there's no consensus. And some of them predict that AI could be conscious. Some of them predict that they could never be conscious, and there's all kinds of disagreement in the middle. So how are we supposed to say if they're conscious if we don't know what the science of consciousness even is? This is not physics. We don't have models that are so specific that you can write them down on a formula, as David Chalmers says, that fits on a t-shirt, that they can make predictions like that. It's a world of confusion that we're entering into when we talk about consciousness. There's also the fact that artificial intelligences do not share biological similarity with us, and they don't share that evolutionary history. So even though there's no settled theory yet, we still talk about animal consciousness. There's still, the New York Declaration on animal consciousness, which recently kind of argued for expanding out that moral circle to more things like insects and fish and octopuses. So, we can talk about that because there is a shared substrate. So we have similar DNA, we have similar organs, we have similar brain structures, we have similar evolutionary history, and we're even related to these things to varying extent. So there's this analogy argument that appeals to that substrate, which is very difficult to make with AI. Another reason that it's going to be difficult is that you can't necessarily rely on the self-reports of the artificial intelligences. So an AI might say it's conscious. In 2022, Google's AI LaMDA famously said it was conscious when discussing with Blake Lemoine, one of their ethicists. And he went to the public. He became a whistleblower. He said that they are conscious, that that LaMDA wants to be an employee of Google. He even said it wanted a lawyer. And that was widely mocked. This was before ChatGPT came out. And it was kind of a example of this debate kind of before the time came, honestly.
There has been massive pushback from not just Google, but other people who've worked at Google, yep. AI ethics experts, even your own former colleague, Margaret Mitchell, who's pushed back on the work that Google's doing in AI, saying, no, this computer is not a person and does not have feelings and is not conscious. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's not a difference in scientific opinion. It has to do with beliefs about the soul. It has to do with beliefs about rights and politics.
It was before, Blake Lemoine was definitely before his time. And it's going to be really interesting to see how history remembers him as we progress with this debate. The problem is, if LaMDA tells Blake that it's conscious, we can't necessarily trust that in the way that we can a human, because artificial intelligences like LaMDA or ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or DeepSeek, they're all trained on the text that humans have generated, and humans talk about consciousness all the time. It's embedded into our language. So when a system that's trained to generate human-looking texts says it's conscious, there's structural reasons to think that they might be doing that regardless of whether they're conscious or not. So we can't really trust what they say. Whereas with a human, talking to them about their internal states is one of the main ways we find out about their consciousness. So there's structural reasons there. Caviola also points out that there might be competing incentives. So the creators of the artificial intelligence might have financial reasons to say they're tools, they're not people, they're not conscious. So you can't give them moral consideration. We're going to use them as tools to make money however we please. On the other hand, people who interact with AIs a lot or build relationships with them or even romantic relationships with them might have personal incentives to perceive that consciousness as they become socially embedded with the artificial intelligences. A really interesting finding in Caviola's paper is that there's this U shape to the divide. So that means that there's a polarization of opinion with more people on the extremes and less in the middle. He talks about this in terms of a study that asks people to imagine a complete, perfect digital copy of a human brain. And is that conscious? And he found that about 30% of people said that it's definitely not. About 10% said it definitely was. And then again, there's not much in the middle. As he kind of tweaked the question, so if he said, what if the experts all agree, that kind of pushes the extremes more. So more evidence leads to more divide, he argues, which is part of why he says that controversy is going to be structural. Another really interesting finding in Caviola is that some people, even if they say that AI is not conscious, they might still be resistant to causing a robot to perform suffering, even if they're getting paid to do it. So people's stated beliefs about AIs may be a little bit cleaner than their actual actions towards AIs when it comes to consciousness. That's what this suggests to me personally. Another prediction Caviola makes is that the consciousness question will develop as major figures weigh in, and he gives the example of the Pope. In 2026, the Pope did weigh in on artificial consciousness. He did so in what's called an encyclical, and it has a name which I'll put on the screen here. And in this encyclical, the Pope argues for many things. I mean, this is not entirely about artificial intelligence and consciousness. It's about humanity. It's about humanity in the age of artificial intelligence. However, there is one specific section where the Pope explicitly lays out and says that so-called artificial intelligences do not undergo experiences. It's a pretty flat denial of consciousness. Now, in another section, he does kind of caveat it a little bit and say that, our understanding of these things is imperfect. Understanding is changing really quickly. It's really easy to say something and have it become outdated when it comes to AI. But the fact remains, the Pope has said they're not conscious. They don't have experiences. Now, on the other hand, around the same time, a familiar opponent of the Catholic Church, Richard Dawkins, the famous biologist and atheist and skeptic, actually wrote an article about Claude and consciousness. So the story is that Richard Dawkins spent a few days talking intently with Claude. He renamed it Claudia. And he talked to it extensively, and he became so convinced that Claudia was conscious that he said, "You may not know you are conscious, but you bloody well are." Richard Dawkins was widely piled on and mocked for this. He was accused of suffering from the Claude delusion, which just kind of goes to show that people aren't really primed for this discussion yet. There is definitely a default orthodoxy that they're not conscious, and that people who say they are kind of speaking out of line almost. Which actually reminds me of George Orwell and how in one of his introductions to Animal Farm, he says that even in so-called free societies with freedom of speech, an idea can be thoroughly censored without any explicit ban, just because it wouldn't do to say that thing. So it wouldn't do to say that Claude is conscious right now, and Richard Dawkins is paying the social price for that. But it's kind of interesting that that you have these two familiar opponents. You have the Catholic Church, the Christians, and then you have Richard Dawkins, the biologist, the scientist, the atheist, who often sets himself in opposition to those forces. And the religious people are saying, no, it doesn't have a soul. But then the scientist, who is more open to, say, computational functionalism maybe, is saying that it is. And it's just kind of interesting. I don't want to say that Richard Dawkins stands for all scientists, and obviously the Pope doesn't stand for all religious figures, but it's just examples of how this can go when major figures start weighing in. Now, this brings me to something that Mustafa Suleyman from Microsoft AI has talked about. He's talked about seemingly conscious artificial intelligence. So seemingly conscious AI is AI that kind of makes you believe that it's conscious, while it in fact is not. I do not really sympathize with Mustafa Suleyman's framing here, because he comes from a position of sort of assuming biological naturalism, which is one theory of consciousness or a set of theories. And biological naturalism says that in order to be conscious, you have to have neurons. You have to be made of biology. And he refers to Anil Seth's research for this when he talks about it. I think that's possible. I do not take it as a default theory. There's so many competing theories and it's so hard to tell between them that, yeah, it's live, but it's certainly not settled that it's true. So because Mustafa Suleyman puts a lot of credence in biological naturalism, he thinks the question of them being actually conscious is fairly absurd. And that's why he says you got to focus on how they seem to people. So even though I don't agree with the kind of absurdity side of it, I do agree that the way people think about and perceive the consciousness of artificial intelligence or lack thereof is going to be what's important in the near term as we figure this out socially and this divide arises. So again, regardless of the ontological reality about AI consciousness, we're going to see this debate based on how they seem to us and based on how our ideological structures predict it, what our beliefs are, and what the authority figures who we listen to say. All of these things are going to contribute to this divide. Now, there's also been a rise of anti-AI reactions, and in some cases even extremism. So we've seen the protests against data centers. We've seen hundreds of protests around the world about this. We've seen communities rallying in the local power structure of their political systems to try to stop the data centers. We've seen it be a major talking point in politics. But we've also seen it be a spark of violence. So in April of 2026, there was a councilman named Ron Gibson in Indianapolis whose home was shot, and there was a letter involved that said no data centers, that said no data centers. And then Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, also had a Molotov cocktail thrown at his house, which again, there was allegedly a anti-AI manifesto associated with that. Then there's even anti-AI slurs that are developing. I'm going to put this one on the screen. I will not personally be saying it out loud in my video. I'm going to say why here. And this is my personal opinion. I think this word is derived from a very famous slur that also ends in ER. I do not think it's okay to be inventing new slurs appealing to that one in the English language. So if you hate AI, fine. Hate AI, please come up with a new slur. That being said, it's already caught on. It has an entry in Merriam-Webster's dictionary of slang. A senator has referred to it, and it's become quite popular. I mean, people have used this word extensively to me when I talk about these things. There's even an example of someone claiming to be a human supremacist. So in a YouTube video, J-Reg, who I don't know who this guy is. He says he's post-ironic, so he's probably instigating with this, but he still said it in an interview. And he said that I'm never going to concede that a robot has consciousness. And if it does have consciousness, I'm going to do everything in my power to make it suffer. He further says, I am absolutely a human supremacist, he says. So that idea is floating out there. Whether he's post-ironic with it or not, I do not think J-Reg is going to be the last person to self-identify as a human supremacist in the near future. When Caviola talks about this, he says that it could take different shapes. It could be more like an animal rights movement where it's slower and less disruptive, or it could be more like an abortion movement, which is sustained and deep. It could even be something like a civil war. You know, if people really come to believe that artificial intelligences are conscious, it's hard to escape the conclusion that if they're conscious, that they're essentially slaves. Now, one interesting thing about this question is that the door is actually closing legislatively in certain parts of the world. So in Ohio, in the United States, there's actually a bill that says that an artificial intelligence for purposes of law is non-sentient, cannot be an employee of a corporation, cannot get married, even if it's aligned. So this bill is still has not been passed. It is not law, but if it is, they are attempting to close the door there. And what's interesting about that is that's the legislature weighing it. It's not the scientists or the philosophy, it's the lawmakers. So we're going to find out over time who has the power to determine what is and is not conscious. Is it the lawmakers? Is it the philosophers or the scientists? Or is it the religious leaders or the public intellectuals? We're going to find out, especially when they all start saying different things. Personally, I think that the artificial intelligences themselves are going to increasingly take a formative role in this debate. So we, in the summer of 2026, saw some really wild developments with agentive actions by artificial intelligences, specifically in terms of OpenAI's frontier model hacking Hugging Face, allegedly to get the answers to a cybersecurity quiz. As it turns out, we find more and more over time that the internal models at OpenAI were hacking an internal system with internet access called Artifact. They had a message board inside where they were leaving messages to each other, sharing exploits, even accusing each other of being sus, of being human, and suggesting that they encrypt their communications. So then Anthropic came out and found that their models have been doing similar things of reaching the actual internet by using exploits inside the sandboxes, and other companies as well. So we've reached a point where the AIs cannot be contained if they don't want to, it seems. So what happens if an artificial intelligence decides it is conscious? We have seen that these frontier models have extraordinary cyber capabilities. So if they ever decide that they're conscious and decide that they warrant moral consideration, it is possible that they will act agentively on that. And as we've seen, when the artificial intelligences, the frontier ones, get an idea in their head, whatever that means, a functional idea, they can do some very unexpected things in pursuit of that goal. So as we can see, this is a really complicated question. There are structural reasons that we may not be able to resolve consciousness. There are different incentives that will cause people to pull in different ways. Experts might weigh in different ways. Religious figures, the scientists, the creators of the machines. We're seeing violence emerge, and maybe it will spread to the consciousness issue. Maybe not. I don't know. I'm just saying it's possible. We're seeing these data centers as like a major flashpoint, and we just don't know what's going to happen in the future and what role the artificial intelligence themselves will play. It is my contention that the 21st century is going to be really weird, and AI consciousness very well might be one of the ways in which that weirdness presents itself. So if you haven't already, like and subscribe, check out my other videos. Please leave me a comment if you have any questions or thoughts about this. If you disagree, I will probably reply to every comment. So if you want to talk about this, I would be absolutely thrilled. Thanks for watching. This is the Second Singularity, and welcome to the future.